Rain pelted the Johnston's decks and hissed like droplets on a hot griddle, steaming on the metal above the shattered boilers in the No. 2 fire room. Where it didn't completely evaporate, the rain cleaned the decks of brine and drying blood. In gun 54, Bob Hollenbaugh set down his sighting telescope and hopped down from the gun, allowing his crew a breather. They emerged from the illusory safety of the gun mount's thin steel walls, taking in their first unshuttered view of the killing field that the ship's decks had become. By now the topside of the Johnston looked like a mess of spaghetti, recalled Robert Billy. So many men were dead, yet the ship itself continued to live, as if animated by its own force of will. That too was an illusion. The ship was running now, manoeuvring at least, principally on the sweat and pain of its sailors. The shells had knocked out not only half the ship's steam power, but most of its electrical power as well. The hits had severed the cables running aft from the No. 2 engine room's distribution board. With the generator knocked out, the aft compartments of the destroyer were without power. The electrical pumps that might have stanched the flood of seawater into the engine rooms could not operate. Worse, there was no power to the steering engine, the motors that powered the ship's large rudder. Without electricity to move the rudder, the only way to turn the ship was via Norwegian steam, the strong backs and shoulders of the enlisted crew. When steering was lost, the call went out for able bodies to report aft men whose battle stations were redundant, gunners on light anti-aircraft mounts, or survivors from crews that had been wiped out, gathered on the fantail. They took turns below decks, teaming up in pairs to crank the two-handled wheel attached to the hydraulic pump that turned the rudder. Facing each other and working in concert, two strong sailors could rotate the wheel reasonably well and move the rudder in accordance with orders called to them from the bridge. The retreating destroyer was changing course so frequently that even the burliest seamen could handle just 15 minutes at a time, and even with their best efforts, the ship was still sluggish at the helm. They never really kept up with the course change orders that Captain Evans was calling over the J-voice phone from the bridge. As leader of the No. 3 repair party stationed in the aft deckhouse, Lieutenant Jesse Cochran was in charge of restoring power to the rearmost parts of the ship. With electricians' mates Alan Cravens and Burton Hoover, gunner's mate third-class Dave Lewis, chief mess cook Dusty Rhodes and others, Cochran pulled cables from the forward engine room's distribution board to the steering motors. But struggle as they did to route casualty power aft, they could not quite complete the circuit. The juice did not flow, and there was no telling why, with masses of cables and wires twisted together like ropes and threaded through round holes in bulkheads. One was all but indistinguishable from another. Certain critical lines had been painted red. What the others did was a mystery. Combat allowed little opportunity for protracted investigation. Critical or not, each cable was responsible for some piece of machinery's proper functioning. They never sorted it out, and the rudder remained powerless. During the 20 or 30 minutes in which Cochran and his repair party fought to restore the spark to the Johnston's workstations aft, the temperature in the engineering spaces had cooled sufficiently to enable a rescue and salvage mission into the riddled bowels of the ship. Motor machinists mate Bob Sochor, Jesse Cochran and other rescuers put on asbestos suits and descended the ladders, slowly, blindly, to search for survivors. In the aft engine room, which was taking on water, Cochran checked the tube packing that kept ocean water from seeping in around the port propeller shaft. It was intact. He then closed the intake valve to the condenser, which turned salt water to fresh for drinking, but still the water rose. Cochran was amazed to find several boiler room machinists crawling like oversized rats out of the bilges below the grating. To elude the killing steam, the enterprising survivors had pressed themselves against the skin of the ship's belly down in the bilges until the cauldron cooled and they could make good their escape. Light from Sochor's battle lantern scarcely penetrated the cavernous darkness. He groped around in the stinking, steam-soaked void, found a body, tied a rope around it, and pushed upward while men on deck lifted from above. When Cochran entered the after-engine room, he found Warrant Officer Johnny Merritt, one of the ship's best machinists and most popular old men, lying face down on the grates where he had fallen at his station. With a heavy wrench in hand, another warrant machinist, Marley Polk, swam beneath the grating in the dark compartment, looking for the source of the inrushing water. As he was submerged, there was a large vibration from a hit somewhere. A heavy piece of engine room machinery dislodged and splashed into the water, trapping him in the bilges. He struggled to get his head above water and ordered his rescuers to save themselves before the water again closed over his head. Bob Sochor shimmied up the ladder to the main deck and removed his asbestos suit. He was looking down at the closed hatch leading to the after-fire room, when to his amazement the round wheel started spinning, turned from below, and the hatch swung open. Trying to climb out was a fireman by the name of West. I ran over to help him up the rest of the way. He had been down in that hot fire room at least 15 or 20 minutes after the boilers were hit and exploded. He stood on deck, his clothes wet and steaming, and he was shaking himself off as if to get the hot steaming clothes off his skin. Electrical fires in the after-engine room burned stubbornly, but eventually succumbed to the cool gusts of rescuers' carbon dioxide bottles. 3 feet of water covered the deck. Rescuers rigged a submersible pump, but the cord didn't reach the power supply. When a longer lead was spliced and linked to the engine room distribution board, still no power came. They would have to make do. Sochor led West and several other wounded to the officers' wardroom, which was used as an operating room in combat. It was an awful sight to see, Sochor said. All those pathetic men sitting and lying on the crowded deck, waiting to be treated by the doctor and pharmacists. Joe Whirling, the engineering officer, ordered Sochor and water tender 3rd class Field and Critz to come with him to the after-fire room. The ship was running on a single screw, the starboard propeller shaft working over capacity at 350 revolutions per minute, just to maintain the limp-along speed of 17 knots. Driven by the turbine and reduction gears in the forward engine room, the shaft was squealing loudly, a sign of possible and doubtless fatal engine failure. Whirling gave Sochor a pail of lube oil and told him to go pour it over the shaft and the spring bearings. Wearing gas masks and holding battle lanterns, Sochor and Critz climbed down through the hatch from which West had just escaped. Experienced snipes, as engine room and fire room personnel were called, could descend the 15-foot ladders to their stations with their feet never touching the steps. Saddled with the protective suit and moving sightlessly through smoke and darkness, Sochor's progress was slower now. The fire room was smoky, filled with steam from the shattered boilers. Cracks of sunlight shone between bent deck plates, but there was not enough light to penetrate the smoke. With little help from our battle lantern, he recalled, we inched our way behind the blown boiler along the narrow catwalk, up and over piping, to the top of the shaft. We poured the oil all over the shaft-bearing box, which stopped the squealing sound. The ship continued creeping back to Sprague's besieged carriers. The interlude in the squall meant that the Japanese cruisers were blind and could not fire on the Americans. A Mark 37 gun director had no such blinders. It was as sharp-eyed in the fog or the dark as it was in the clear of midday. While the ship was enshrouded by rain, the gun director's radar spied the column of Japanese cruisers closing on the escort carrier formation. As Bob Hagan and his gunners fired some 105-inch rounds at the nearest Japanese cruiser, the squall's only impact on the efficiency of the Johnston's gunnery department was the rude manner in which it soaked Hagan's smokes. It was the first time in my life I didn't mind having a package of cigarettes ruined, he wrote. Time, however, was not on Taffy 3's side. Though 2 Japanese cruisers, the Suzuya, damaged by aerial attack, and the Kumano, hit by the Johnston, were out of the battle, the 4 others still had their legs, and their captains were determined to draw blood. Through nearly 3 years of war, no aircraft carrier had fallen to Japanese guns. Admiral Kurita credited heavenly intervention for the opportunity. He would soon be in position to make use of it. Largely on the independent initiative of its different division commanders, the Japanese fleet was fanned out and advancing in roughly parallel columns. 4 heavy cruisers steaming southward, out to the east, the Yamato and the Nagato looming a step behind them to Taffy 3's north, the Haruna and the Congo making independent tracks ahead of their slower heavies, and 2 destroyer squadrons bringing up the rear. Against them came the Hoel, the Herman and the Samuel B. Roberts, formed into a loose semblance of a column and steaming into the open moor of the armoured behemoths arrayed before them. Like the Roberts before her, the Hoel had narrowly avoided a collision with the Herman as Hathaway's destroyer made its dash across the Taffy 3 formation to line up for the attack. Now the three steamed north at flank speed, while Sprague's jeep carriers ran southward. With each turn of their screws, the gulf between the destroyers and the carriers widened. Their exposure, their utter vulnerability grew starker with every passing minute. Destroyers were hit-and-run ships. As the Japanese had demonstrated time and time again with their own tin cans, and as Oldendorf's destroyers had shown at Surigao Strait, torpedo attacks were best executed under the cover of night. This would be no replay of Surigao Strait, though their stacks billowed smoke amid sheltering rain squalls. Ziggy Sprague's screening ships attacked in daylight. Their opponents had roughly 3 times the gun power of Nishimura's group. The Americans were unsupported by a powerful battle line, whose large guns offered a sheltering canopy to hide under upon withdrawal and a devastating deterrent to enemy pursuit. Moreover, Kurita's center force was not confined to a strait, roaming free in open ocean. His ships had both rooms to maneuver and speed sufficient to overtake and encircle the jeep carriers and destroy them from all sides. For the destroyer screen, the risk of encirclement was moot, for they were offering themselves for slaughter, throwing themselves willingly into it in the hope of delaying the inevitable for the carriers. Perhaps they would harry the Japanese enough to let Sprague's escort carriers slip away. I had heard all along that destroyers were expendable but never quite believed. Now I knew it was true. Everett Lindorf of the Hoel would write. From the gun deck on the fantail of the Fanshawe Bay, situated on the northwest edge of the circular pod of fleeing escort carriers, ship's cook Harold Kite had a front-row seat from which to observe the destroyer screen forming into line for their torpedo run. His battle station was in the handling room below the ship's lone 5-inch gun. When the gun was firing, he, Jack Frisch and Warren Whitaker fed projectiles and powder cases into the hoist that supplied the crew on the open-mounted Stinger or pea-shooter. Until the enemy got closer, the crew that Kite supplied did not have anything to shoot at, but with a clear 180-degree vista off the stern, there was certainly a lot to watch. Kite looked on awestruck as the destroyers fell into line, lit off their boilers, and left their stations by the carriers to race off toward the Japanese battle line. The little ships seemed to possess a spirit all their own, and they reminded him of something: horses. On his family's 250-acre farm in central Oklahoma, Kite worked with the Percheron draft horses that hauled his dad's plows and pulled his wagons. They were powerful animals, stalwart and dependable. He knew the habits of the big black and grey beasts. Whenever a thunderstorm loomed across the plains, the broad-shouldered workhorses became as skittish as stallions. Their eyes bulged, their nostrils flared, spurred by the drop in barometric pressure. They sprinted and dashed around the pasture. When they accelerated from a standstill, their hindquarters dropped down, legs jackhammering the earth, heads pulled high, manes waving in the wind. Harold Kite thought the 2 destroyers and the destroyer escort sprinting into attack looked like that now, like horses sprinting exuberantly across a watery pasture. At flank speed, the Fletchers tossed up a flaring bow wave like a mane, and their sterns sat low, digging their screws into the sea, sprinting like Percherons madly energized by a low-pressure front. As the flagship of Commander Thomas's screen, the Hoel led the loose column, followed by the Herman, then went that determined pony, the Samuel B. Roberts. Kite figured this would be the last he would see of these ships and their vaguely equine nobility. He felt a lump rise in his throat at the realization that most likely none of them would survive to run under the thunder again. Seaman First Class. Sam Lucas could feel the Hoel's deck vibrating from the exertions of the turbines. Their deep steam-driven hum resonated in his sternum. Lucas, a torpedoman striker, and torpedoman third-class Earl Tompkins busied themselves setting the depth charges on the starboard and portside racks on safe. There would soon likely be plenty of exploding going on, no need to contribute to the fireworks. Painted with sharply angled camouflage patterns to confuse enemy lookouts, the Hoel was nevertheless inescapably framed against the veil of smoke and squalls behind her. The Japanese gunners walked splashes up and down and back along the American ship's line of advance. Jack Creamer, the Hoel's assistant gunnery officer, could see the problem the impromptu torpedo line faced. Time and distance were not on their side. While the Hoel was laying smoke for the carriers, the Japanese had closed the range rapidly with the formation. Because Captain Kintberger's destroyer was closest to the enemy, she had the least room to maneuver to prepare her attack. The column was too long, the enemy too close, and the visibility too spotty for the United States ships to coordinate effectively. The Americans and Japanese closed at a combined rate of more than 50 knots. Zigzagging to avoid shell fire, and simultaneously calculating his own best approach to fire the Hoel's 10 torpedoes at the proper angle to the enemy ships, Kintberger was forced to seize his chance when it presented itself. The Hoel's skipper elected to pass between the columns of battleships and cruisers. His ship would be exposed to fire from all sides, but at least there would be no shortage of targets. The steel decks were slick with rain. Despite the embrace of the laden tropical air, Hugh Koffelt, a gunner on one of the amidships 40mm mounts, realized that he was shivering. Fred Green was on his game in the Combat Information Center, lining up the torpedo attack and plotting the progress of the overwhelming Japanese force. Bridge, this is combat. Range 165 Oh, give us a sight bearing on the battleships. 342 that checks with ours by radar. Where is the cruiser column? 358. Destroyers, 291 and 339 that leaves the big ships unprotected then. Captain, suggest a course of 353. Then Green gave the gunnery officer, Lieutenant Bill Sanders, the benefit of the data flowing in from his radar. Gunnery control, this is combat. Stand by to open fire, range 14500. Stand by, I'll give a mark on 14,000 yards. Stand by to open fire, stand by, mark 14000. On cue, the Hoel's 2 forward guns opened up, crashing out at a large grey form looming off her bow. Sanders had a heavy cruiser in his sights. On the bridge, everyone's ears rang from the concussion of guns 51 and 52. Lieutenant Dix didn't mind the roar. Damn, it was good to hear them speaking out. The whole ship trembled with their rapid bursts, and Sanders up above us grinning. There was giving out gun orders to his crews, making them keep close enough for the guns. Pace. But to launch torpedoes, they needed to get a bit closer. Sanders slewed his gun director mount and trained his batteries on a battleship. The 3 after turrets joined in now, bucking the ship with their stiff report. The destroyer plunged ahead, fishtailing through shell splashes as the decks rattled from the exertions of her power plant. They haven't hit us yet, Lieutenant Dix thought as the Hoel closed to torpedo launching range. We're almost there. We're all together now. Let's make it good. It all happened in the space of 100 seconds, the events coming too fast for even the most meticulous quartermaster to record in his log. The sequence of events during the battle is obscured by some doubt. There is ambiguity in official documents whether the Hoel was hit before or after Sprague issued his order to the destroyers, the big boys, to make their torpedo attack. The talk between ships' logs of several Taffy 3 warships records Sprague's order going out at 7:35 a.m. or 7:40 a.m., 10 to 15 minutes after the Hoel was hit on her way in to attack, at 7:25 a.m. The log of the destroyer escort Raymond, relied upon by Samuel Eliot Morrison and John Toland, places the order at 7:16 a.m., which makes more sense, since the Hoel survivors consistently assert that their ship got hit on the way in, and that Kintberger did not act ahead of orders. Admiral Sprague's own published account of the battle suggests that he may have issued the order even earlier. Despite the 29 minutes of ambiguity, and 29 minutes is an eternity in a running battle, we do know with near certainty that the Hoel was first hit at 7:25 a.m. At 7:25 a.m., the Hoel's impossible luck ran out. Leon Kintberger had been chasing salvos in a desperate bid to keep the Hoel alive. Battleships and cruisers had the ship's range, and so the splashes were not hard to find. The closer the ship got, however, the more futile the concept of dodging salvos became. It was mostly a pretense in any event, for no ship could actually dodge a high-velocity inbound shell. The first one that hit them was small in caliber, small at least relative to the 14, 16, and 18-inch battleship rounds that were splitting the air with palpable roars, and, at the end of their 20-mile trajectories, losing their grip on the sky and falling downward like tumbling trash cans. This one came in fast and unseen, striking the bridge high on the port side. Lieutenant Dix thought, "Oh, Jesus, this is it." The ship rocked and staggered. There was a flash and a crump and a whistling hail of metal that killed most of the men in the wheelhouse immediately. Lieutenant Earl Nason, Quartermaster Herbert Dubrava, Fire Controlman Marcelino Di Lello, and Soundman Otto Kumpunen were gone in an instant. A surreal cloud of green-dyed mist settled over the carnage, sitting in the pilot-house lookout's chair overlooking Gun 52. Seaman First Class Keith McKay felt a rush of wind around his left calf, looked down, and saw that shrapnel had shredded his dungarees. Blood was running down into his shoe, so he tied a red bandana around his ankle. He looked down at the water sloshing around the deck of the bridge and saw that it ran not green but red. The reassuring rumble and grind of Bill Sanders's rotating Mark 37 gun director stopped, leaving only ominous silence from the shattered battle station above. The blast spattered the Hoel's passageways with the remains of breakfast. Pork and beans and cinnamon rolls flew out of the galley and littered the decks. The cloud of vaporized green dye dispersed and seemed to drift down the length of the ship as the Hoel pressed ahead. Some men who saw it wondered what new horror the Japanese now unleashed. Cries of gas. Gas could be heard from panicked crew. Thrown from his chair at the helm, Clarence Hood regained consciousness on the starboard side of the pilot-house and saw that Lieutenant Dix had taken over the wheel. Commander Thomas and Captain Kintberger were both hurt, but their injuries were minor. Hood's were too, so he took back his post. Miles to the north, Admiral Kurita saw an American ship erupt in smoke and flame, probably the Hoel, and the Yamato's log recorded the cruiser observed blowing up and sinking at 7:25 a.m. With the fire control radar gone, control of the Hoel's guns fell to the Combat Information Center team, led by Lieutenants Green and Creamer. They were able to take ranges with the much less finely tuned surface search radar. The two officers focused on lining up the torpedo attack and relaying range and bearing information to the guns. As the ship groped its way toward the oncoming fleet, Hoyt White, a radarman in the Combat Information Center, called out ranges and bearings of the Japanese cruisers to the gunners over the sound-powered phones. 13,000 yards, 12,500 yards. The men winced at every vibration and rattle as the shells struck near the ship. Seeing the destruction with one's own eyes evoked one kind of fear. Not being able to see it was perhaps worse. The men in the Combat Information Center, or the radio shack, or the engine room, or the gun mounts, or in any of the ship's other enclosed spaces, were spared the horrid beauty of the red, green, yellow, and blue waterspouts rising around the ship. Hoyt White felt the Hoel reel and shudder, absorbing the blows. There was no telling how serious any particular hit was, or where the next one would strike. From time to time he found himself staring at the bulkhead that stood between him and the humid, smoky air, and wondering when a round might burst through it, bearing his name. As the three small ships pressed through the squalls on their run against the Japanese heavy ships, the staggering Hoel in the lead, followed by the Herman and the Samuel B. Roberts, a sight greeted them unlike any they had seen before. A smoking, grey-black wreck of metal, crawling south as they charged north. It was the Johnston, limping along on one engine with no hydraulic steering. The ship was a ruin, and yet somehow Captain Evans was pulling her through, returning to formation, though the destroyer remained on a fairly even keel. The battering she had taken was all too evident. The mast had toppled down around the superstructure, the metal shields and bulkheads around the bridge and the stacks were blackened, torn, riddled, and dented like a coffee can on a backyard tree stump. How a ship in that condition could still make steam was for its engineers to explain. By any fair measure, the Johnston was entitled to call it a day. Her torpedo tubes were empty, at her hobbled 17-knot speed. She couldn't keep up with the other destroyers on the way in. Sprague's carriers needed her smoke. Everyone on the Johnston's bridge had heard the Admiral's order, directing the small boys to form up and attack. Few, if any, believed it applied to their ship. Surely they weren't expected to turn around and go in again. When Captain Evans saw the Hoel and the Herman, with the Samuel B. Roberts lagging behind in column, he arrived at a different view of his obligation. As long as his ship had guns that worked, the Cherokee figured he could do something in a fight. He told his dumbstruck men on the bridge, "We'll go in with the destroyers and provide fire support." Evans ordered Ed DeGardi to bring the Johnston around astern the Roberts and informed his officers of the plan. Owing to steering difficulties, the destroyer made a complete circle before steadying on course. The Johnston fell in line with the three other ships, plying the shell-torn waters between them and the Japanese fleet. "Oh, dear Lord, I'm in for a swim," Bob Hagan said to himself. On the bridge of the Hoel, Commander Thomas watched the other escorts in the strung-out torpedo line, while Captain Kindberger steadied the ship on her own firing course. Torpedo Officer Lieutenant Coleman, who had moved from the bridge to Torpedo Mount No. 2, owing to the loss of communication with his mounts, took over the helm as ranges and bearings were called out by Green and Creamer in the Combat Information Center. The Hoel's torpedo mounts swung out to starboard. There a battleship loomed at a range of 10,000 yards. Kindberger bore in closer, fishtailing into 9,000 yards off the starboard beam of a battleship, probably the Congo, whose long dark form was visible intermittently through the smoke. Tube 1, 1 eye, half salvo, starboard side, steady now, match pointers, ready 1, stand by. Fire 1. 5 torpedoes rushed over the starboard rail and smacked the sea, running hot, straight and normal. Kindberger ordered, left full rudder, and the Hoel leaned into the helmsman's hard turn of the wheel, running away to the south. Below decks, amid the roar of the boilers and the 120-degree heat, water-tender third class Francis Hostrander felt the ship shudder as a Japanese shell entered the forward fire room on the starboard side, just above the waterline. It blasted a hole in the hull 2 feet in diameter, blowing a spray of red-hot shrapnel into the men working the boilers. Many were injured, but mercifully the storm of metal left the steam lines intact. The space went dark, save for the beam of daylight entering through the bulkhead's newest porthole. No one's name had been on that oversized bullet. The roar of the boilers surged on. Seconds later, another salvo struck, and one of its shells was covered with names. It entered the after-fire room, shattering lines and setting loose a holocaust of superheated steam. Those who were not immediately scalded to death were trapped by the hot steam cloud that rose to the top of the compartment and gathered by the escape hatch, blocking their exit until it cooled and condensed. 16 of 17 men died. A sailor named Vern Simmons was the compartment's sole survivor. Another shell punched through the port side into the after-engine room, making a clean 2-foot hole just above the waterline and exploding against the heavy steel housing of the reduction gears, freezing the Hoel's port screw. The destruction of the turbine shut down half the ship's electrical generating capacity too. A cloud of wayward steam escaped topside, engulfing the crew of Gun 53 amidships in white vapor. Another shell struck below them in the gun's handling room, starting a fire that laced the white clouds through black smoke. Live steam swamped the 40mm gun on the port side amidships. Dick Santos, a radioman striker who was the trainer on that mount, had his feet and ankles burned so severely that he could not walk. Shrapnel peppered his back and legs, bathed in steam. The position was fast becoming untenable, but Santos couldn't move. Ship's cook third-class Jim Norris, with Santos, had a clear line of sight aft. He watched the shells hit Gun 53 and the engine and fire room. Guys were piling out of there screaming. Some were scalded and some of them were on fire. God, it was awful. I didn't count the hits. Let's say there were too damn many rolling masses of superheated steam finally drove Norris away from his mount. He ran toward the bow and tried to get inside Gun 52, but the crew refused him and held the hatch shut. Norris climbed down the ladder, running to the main deck from Gun 52's platform, and heard men praying somewhere in an interior passageway. He came upon the bodies of pharmacist's mate, third-class John Quinn, and ship's cook, first-class J.R. Lindsay, lying sprawled on the deck. The sight of their corpses rinsing in bloody seawater made him retch. Across the deck from Santos and Norris, the explosion lifted the heavy tub of the starboard 40mm gun right off its revolving base. From within the steam cloud, Larry Morris couldn't see a thing. When the whipping wind washed it away, the seaman first class realized that several of his crew, including his gun captain, had disappeared altogether. 3 more shells from God knew where rocked the Hoel astern, one near the base of Gun 55, freezing the mount in train. Another one whistled overhead, slicing off the length of Gun 54's barrel as cleanly as a giant blowtorch. The 6-foot tube of hardened, rifled steel clanged to the deck and began rolling to and fro with the fantail's every tilt. The final shell from this deadly salvo struck the chemical smoke generators on the fantail, spewing white phosphorus across the deck, which burned and burrowed into sailors' exposed flesh. "Stuff just flew all over us on the 40mm gun," said Hugh Coffelt, the pointer on the mount aft of Gun 53. We had no protection at all. The Japanese kept firing at us, with great success, sometimes missing though, and when they did miss, it sounded like a freight train passing by. Then they began to use shells that would explode over us. That was when I and others on the gun got hit with shrapnel. I got hit so hard that it knocked me off my seat to the deck. I was the only pointer on that 40mm gun, and I still can't figure out how I was knocked off that seat to the deck, as I was hit in my left chest, not far from my heart. After turning on the smoke generator at the start of the battle, Sam Lucas had little else to do. He didn't relish being a spectator to the horror unfolding around him, so he lay down on the deck between the depth charge racks and the gun shield of a fantail 20mm mount. He felt no need to see what came next. Seaman First Class, Marvin Compromiso, and Signalman Second Class. Charles Patton lay down beside him. They could hear the severed barrel of gun 54 lolling heavily back and forth across the pitching deck. The sound of an aircraft engine, it sounded low, down on the water, moving in, getting louder. The chatter of machine guns out over the water. They were not American guns. They heard the screams and shouts as men ran for cover, and they heard the staccato crack of the Hoel's 20s firing back. They felt the ship lurch hard 3 times from heavy hits amidships. Then Lucas felt something burning horribly on his neck and back. He did not want to know what it was, and he was too scared to give it a great deal of thought. Dye and shrapnel and asbestos and a soaking stench of blood, it all filled the air over and around the battered after section of the Hoel. Somehow the destroyer did not break up and sink, although even her designers at the Bureau of Ships and her builders at Mare Island might have expected any ship to do so under such a pummeling. The 3/8-inch steel of her hull held, her rudder did not. At the helm, Quartermaster Clarence Hood found his wheel suddenly unresponsive. The Hoel still carried 5 torpedoes that needed to get in the water, but now the ship could not maneuver to fire them. The rudder was locked in a hard turn to port, leaving the ship steaming in a circle drawn tighter because only the starboard screw was propelling them now. The Hoel passed through a rain squall, but the respite was too brief to do any lasting good. As the wounded destroyer circled against her will, the air was cut by the whoosh and roar of the concentrated enemy fusillades. The Congo, which loomed off its starboard beam when the first spread of torpedoes was fired, came into view again, this time to port, as the Hoel wheeled around and around out of control, helpless to evade. Shells were hitting with terrifying regularity all around the ship. The Japanese battleships' imposing 14-inch rifles were mounted in pairs in sleek turrets, 2 forward, 2 aft. Now somehow the battleship's dark mass seemed to be shrinking into the distance, becoming smaller as it turned away from the Hoel. The Congo's lookouts had spied the Hoel's first spread of torpedoes. Its helmsman turned to present the smallest profile to them. Looming into view, some 6,000 yards off the port beam, came the Japanese heavy cruisers. Kindberger couldn't ignore them and hoped to survive, though the ship was still locked into its sickening turn. He could not wait for his steering to come back. He and Lieutenant Coleman knew what they had to do. They would launch their last 5 torpedoes on the fly, or they would not do so at all. "Get set to fire," Kindberger ordered. "Lead cruiser, all remaining fish, stand by, tube 2, train out to port, curve 5 ahead. Quick now, we're swinging fast, all ready, fire." From his 40mm gun amidships, Dick Santos saw a chief standing atop the torpedo mount, hammer in hand. One by one, the chief brought down the mallet on the torpedo's manual firing pins. They leapt out in succession and hit the water as the Hoel continued her inexorable turn to port. Minutes passed as the ship and her weapons ran their separate courses. The ship travelled in a counterclockwise arc as the torpedoes sped straight across the arc's base. Lynn Lowry, the bridge messenger, gasped and pointed down at the water. He could see 3 torpedo wakes, running along the ship's bow on the port side. Could they be from the Hoel, whatever their origin? The Hoel was in danger of running into their path. Instinctively, before realizing the futility of it, Lieutenant Dix shouted, "Right full rudder," but the rudder was still dead. The big undersea missiles passed several feet ahead of the bow and continued on toward the cruisers, now almost dead ahead of the stricken destroyer. Dix didn't see it, as too much was happening to stand and watch, but others saw the torpedoes stay on course. Lieutenant Coleman announced the countdown. At about the time the Hoel's second salvo was scheduled to hit, Columns of water were seen rising beside the storm-grey hull of an enemy man-of-war. With her torpedoes now spent, somehow the Hoel had to regain steerage and return to the carriers. Quartermaster Third Class Donald Ulmanek, manning the after-steering room, was ordered to commence manual steering from the aft steering engine compartment. Kintberger ordered all signalmen and lookouts on the bridge to go aft, join Ulmanek, and man the wheel powering the pump that turned the rudder. Somehow the Hoel needed to get back on station by the carriers, laying smoke, standing by, and protecting its herd. With the gyro out, Kintberger asked Fred Green which way south was. Lieutenant Green didn't need instruments to answer that one. He responded, "Put the sun on your port beam." Kintberger told Lynn Lowry, who was leaving for the steering engine room, to get ready to steer a 180-degree base course, with 10-degree zigzags to either side. On one good engine, Kintberger would race his stricken ship against time, against the oncoming cruisers that were relentlessly closing the distance, and against the seawater flooding his sole functioning engine room. As flames heated the decks beneath their feet, volunteers for rudder pump duty sprinted down both sides of the 376-foot ship under a hail of shrapnel that rained down from the explosions overhead. Past dead bodies, some dismembered and others startlingly intact, through slicks of blood and pork and beans and gobs of dye-stained asbestos insulation, and through the last gasps of steam rising from the engineering spaces below. Reaching the fantail, they grabbed the hatch leading to the steering engine room, cranked it open and pulled it up. They shimmied down the ladder, looking to restore with muscle and sweat the steam power that enabled the ship to maneuver. The Fanshawe Bay's single open-mount 5-inch gun was placed on the stern, as if to anticipate the likeliest circumstance of its use, fending off an assailant while beating a flank-speed retreat. As the Japanese cruiser column closed range on the jeeps, Ziggy Sprague ordered the carriers to open fire with their pea-shooters. The flagship's gun sat inside a 30-foot diameter turntable mounted on ball bearings. Below it, Kite, Frisch, and Whitaker loaded the hoist that brought projectiles and powder cases to the gun deck. They would do 20 or so at a time, then climb up the ladder, sit down, watch the dim forms of the Japanese ships flash at them on the horizon, and feel their teeth rattle from the blast of the Fanny B's own gun. Then they would go back below and do it again. Though an electrical elevator did all the lifting, long summers spent hoeing corn, chopping cotton, and tossing 80-pound hay bales put Kite in good enough shape to do a lot of it himself. The gun's recoil was considerably stronger. However, once when he was on the ladder between decks, the gun discharged and the whole ship seemed to shove forward. Kite was jarred off the ladder and dropped through space, his hands clawing through 15 feet of air. Watching large enemy men-of-war shoot at his ship made an indelible impression on the 21-year-old. It was distinct to 1,800 pounds, the size of a Volkswagen coming through the air. It was a bulge of fire with a bullet in the middle of it, and it made you want to get somewhere. Usually there would be 15 or 20 seconds to make good an escape before the shell landed. Kite considered it natural for any individual to want to hide or get out of harm's way. On an escort carrier, hiding from enemy fire was at best a psychological game. At worst, it could be downright embarrassing. "One old boy was always looking for a place to hide," he said to me. "Here, Kite, get on top of me." The sailor huddled down on the deck, and Kite climbed on top of him, wondering all the while what good it would have done. The shell would have gone through both of us. The pea-shooter crews on Taffy 3's carriers fired to good effect. An old chief on the Fanshawe Bay watched the St. Lo's gunners popping away, and with a pinch of salt observed, "They ought to fire that thing underwater. We could use a little jet propulsion right now, but the guns proved to be surprisingly useful in their intended application. They scored 3 hits on a heavy cruiser at 14,000 yards, starting a raging fire on the forecastle. Meanwhile, the White Plains was doing its own unlikely imitation of a fighting ship of the line. As the enemy cruisers hammered away at shrinking range, a gunnery officer shouted out, "Just hold on a little longer, boys. We're sucking them into 40mm range." The Japanese split their 4 cruisers into 2 columns, one looking to overtake the carriers to port, the other joining a group of destroyers and advancing to Sprague's starboard. My carriers were formed in a large circle, with the destroyers and destroyer escorts in a larger circle around them. I kept this formation on a southwesterly course, squeezing over 10 to 20 degrees to one side and then to the other, according to which side was throwing the hottest fire. The ships held formation and manoeuvred together, their discipline impressing even Kurita's chief of staff, Tomiji Koyanagi. I must admit admiration for the skill of their commanders, he would write. High above the action, it was plain enough to VC-10 skipper Edward Huxtable what the Japanese commander was trying to do. Already the cruisers, beleaguered by buzzing planes though they were, had made frightening progress outrunning Taffy 3 to the east. For Sprague, further eastward flight was futile. Huxtable advised Sprague that the best course was now south. Of course, Sprague's radar told him all of this, and more. By 7:30 a.m. the Taffy 3 commander was already charging hard to the south, now and then angling towards Samar to the southwest. As the pilots pressed home their attacks, word came over the radio that Taffy 3's destroyer screen was engaging the Japanese fleet, and pilots were cautioned not to hit the inbound American ships. Sprague's decision to turn from a southeasterly heading to the southwesterly one was risky. By turning right so sharply, he would give the Japanese a chance to turn inside him, cutting into his circular route and bearing down fast on his starboard broadside. Nevertheless, he felt the need to turn in the direction of help, toward Leyte Gulf, where Oldendorf's battleships lay. And if the Japanese didn't catch on in time, Sprague might open some distance between Taffy 3 and its pursuers. With visibility down to half a mile, and with the clouds hovering at a ceiling of 500 feet, Sprague ordered a turn to a course of 200 degrees. Kurita did not get wind of the audacious maneuver until Taffy 3 had emerged from the rain squall. The Japanese admiral followed the escort carrier formation around in this clockwise quarter circle, his pursuit slowed by the frequent need to evade the incessant piecemeal attacks of the hell-for-leather American aviators. Ziggy Sprague had gambled and, for now, won. Blue Archer and the rest of the planes from the Kinan Bay needed just a few minutes to find the Japanese fleet. When Pops Keeley's radio malfunctioned, Patsy Capano took the lead. At about 7:50 a.m. they happened upon a column of destroyers. Capano, Keeley and Archer came out of the clouds and went right down the line, firing short bursts from their wing-mounted machine guns. The flight of Avengers climbed back into the clouds and joined with 7 other Avengers and 10 Wildcats hunting for bigger ships. Within minutes, an echelon of cruisers and battleships came into view. On cue from Capano, the pilots turned and plummeted. Third in line, Archer dove at 2 cruisers as they leaned hard into a leftward turn. From 4,500 feet, Archer dropped all 4 bombs and landed 2 good hits. He recovered, climbed and circled around again. Time to use the rockets. The ordnance crews on the Kinan Bay aligned the rockets to follow the same path the machine gun bullets traversed, converging 1,000 feet ahead of the plane. Pushing over in a 30-degree dive on another heavy cruiser, Archer squeezed short bursts from his wing guns to keep his aim true. Then, 1,000 feet out, he pressed the button on the top of his stick and let his 8 rockets fly. Archer had become proficient using rockets at Saipan and Guam, knocking out tanks and large trucks and small houses with the weapons in support of the Marines advancing inland. Now he watched them walk up the forecastle of the cruiser. 2 of them hit the bridge, exploding brightly and appearing to knock loose some steel weather shields around the main superstructure. The light bomb loads that some of the pilots carried led them to wonder what precisely they ought to be trying to accomplish. 2 other pilots from the Kinan Bay, whose radio call sign was Georgia, debated whether to attack some destroyers they had found or seek out larger quarry. Tom Van Brunt, a St. Lo pilot returning from the aborted morning anti-submarine patrol with the other VC-65 flyers, heard a squeaky voice over his headset. "This is 81 Georgia. Are there any other Georgia planes in the area?" A low, slow southern drawl came in reply. "This is 84 Georgia. I have you in sight. I'll join up. This is 81 Georgia. What kind of arms do you have?" "I'm loaded with 100-pound anti-personnel bombs. What do you have?" "I have the same loading. What kind of target do you think we should take?" 84 Georgia. "We better try one of them destroyers. This is 81 Georgia. I'm senior to you, and I think we ought to attack a battleship." "This is 84 Georgia," the voice drawled. "Won't do no good." Now 81 Georgia drew on a source of motivation far more powerful than mere rank. 84 Georgia, if you're scared, go back to the carrier. "This is 84 Georgia. I'll go anywhere you go, God damn it. the Japanese cruisers endured a savage strafing attack by the fighter pilots of Taffy 3. Lieutenant Jim Murphy of the Kinan Bay's VC-3 found the Japanese fleet almost immediately upon clearing the rain squall that was drenching the carrier's decks. He owed the honour of flying that day to his fleetness of foot. He had beaten his executive officer, Gil Halliday, by a few steps to the last plane on the flight deck. Little Murph was prepared to yield to superior rank, but Halliday yielded to speed. Murphy had gotten there first. "Go ahead," Halliday said, "and good luck." Murphy took off at 7:25 a.m., the last plane off the ship. He joined Lieutenant Ken Hipper and Ensign George Heinmiller in strafing a heavy cruiser. Over later, the day before, Lieutenant Hipper had become an ace in 7 minutes, shooting down 5 twin-engine Lily bombers that were headed for MacArthur's troops. Hippy's targets now were considerably larger, if less prone to disintegrating under his guns. Pushing over and diving down as if riding an invisible waterfall, the pilots made 3 runs before becoming separated. Murphy then formed up with Lieutenant Leonard Porterfield and dove on another cruiser. Porterfield told Murphy he was out of bullets and headed for Tacloban. Little Murph's next dance partner was Ensign Paul Hopfner, who formed up on his wing and helped him ruin a Japanese destroyer's day. The fire that met the pilots over the effectiveness of the pilot's own shooting, after his second pass on the cruisers, Murphy noted with satisfaction that the Japanese ships were manoeuvring to avoid them. The Kinan Bay took her first hit at 7:50, just as Blue Archer was firing his rockets at the heavy cruiser. Steaming on the windward side of the formation, exposed to view as the smoke screen was blown west, the carrier absorbed Japanese cruiser shells at the rate of about 1 a minute. Some skipped like rocks over her deck, gouging the wooden flight deck and showering splinters into the air. In total, the fragile escort carrier took 15 hits from the cruiser's 8-inch main batteries. 1 shell breached the port side of the hull just above the machine shop, angled down through the machine shop, and burst in the freshwater tank and the fuel oil settling tanks. While investigating the extent of the damage to the critical oil tanks, Engineering Officer Lieutenant George H. Keeler could hear loud crashes and other novel sounds of material fracture and stress, but above all others we could hear men screaming. The shell's screeching impacts scrapped the innards of the Kinan Bay right before the crew's horrified eyes. Armor-piercing shells penetrated the thin hull and flight deck without exploding, turning the ship into an oversized colander. Shells hitting below the waterline let torrents of ocean water rush in. In a narrow wedge of a compartment at the very bow of the ship, Seaman First Class Morris Turner was up to his waist in water, pouring in through 2 holes left by a shell that had punched clean through both sides of the hull, right at the waterline. Mattresses and large corks and pillows floated all around him as he struggled to keep the debris clear of the intake of the submersible pump he was operating. Other sailors in the compartment pressed mattresses up against the shell holes, but every time the ship moved out of a wave trough and plunged into another swell, the sudden increase in water pressure shoved aside the mattresses and forced more water in. Standing in the rising water, Turner had trouble gaining leverage against the incoming flow. After hours of work, struggling to keep the pumps operating and the inflow down, he and the other sailors brought the water down to a manageable level. In so doing, they very likely saved their ship. If the compartment had failed, the Kinan Bay's bow would have ploughed under the sea, the swamped ship would have lost her speed and seaworthiness, and in all probability the Japanese would have caught her. She would have met that fate no matter the heroics of her crew. Escort carriers were not built to take 15 major-caliber hits and survive, but the Kinan Bay did just that. Shells damaged her degaussing cables and tore shelving and ruptured bulkheads and opened the hull to flooding, and they ripped 6 holes in the flight deck and wrecked support beams below it. They punctured lube oil tanks, contaminating the ship's freshwater system, ruined radio and radar gear, sprayed compartments with metal splinters, filled passageways with noxious fumes and gases, ignited acetylene bottles, started electrical fires, and rendered bunkrooms uninhabitable. The extent of the ship's luck was truly staggering. The day before, one well-placed Japanese bomb had sunk Halsey's light carrier, the Princeton. A single torpedo had once filled the skies with the remains of the Leyte Bay. Somehow now, however, the escort carrier known as the Lucky K took 15 hard blows from heavy cruiser shells, at least 5 of which exploded, and sailed on with just 5 dead and 55 wounded. It is astounding that her losses were not far, far higher. At 7:50 a.m. Admiral Kurita's force was spread out over 15 miles of ocean as it pursued Sprague's fleeing carriers. The crippled Kumano, assisted by the Suzuya, lagged behind as the westernmost Japanese ship as she completed the transfer of Admiral Shiraishi's flag. The light cruiser Noshiro, heading a column of 7 destroyers, passed the 2 crippled heavy cruisers to their north, but forced to circle by vicious strafing attacks by Wildcat fighters, came onto a southward course that carried her away from the eastward charging Yamato, the Nagato, and the Haruna. Northeast of the 3 other battleships, the Congo was running southeast and turning a wide clockwise circle as she traced the course of the 4 heavy cruisers in line ahead of her. Those 4 ships, the Tone, the Chikuma, the Haguro, and the Chokai, on the other side of a large rain squall from the Yamato, ran south by southeast, turning an arc through the compass toward the south, matching Ziggy Sprague's circular course. As the Japanese cruisers bore down on the jeep carriers, the American pilots stepped up the tempo of their attacks, buzzing the ships with the ferocity of hornets, determined to drive them back at whatever cost. According to Ziggy Sprague, the Wildcat pilots were given a free hand to strafe, with the hope that their strafing would kill personnel on the Japanese ships, silence automatic weapons, and, most important, draw attention from the struggling escort carriers. Sometimes 2 or 4 Wildcats would join up for a strafing run. Again, a Wildcat would join up and run interference for an Avenger. Then, likely as not, it would turn out that the Avenger had no torpedo or bomb and was simply making a dummy run. When their ammunition was given out, the fighters also made dry runs to turn the pursuers. Lieutenant Paul Garrison of Seaside, Oregon, made 20 strafing runs, 10 of them dry. The attack was almost incessant. Kurita's operations officer, Commander Tonosuke Tani, would write, but the number of planes at any one instant was few. The bombers and torpedo planes were very aggressive and skillful, and the coordination was impressive, even in comparison with the great experience of American attack that we had already had. This was the most skillful work of your planes. Lieutenant Thomas J. Lupo, an Avenger pilot from the Fanshawe Bay, was one of the first pilots to reach Tacloban once the initial wave of attacks by Taffy 3's pilots had crested and broken and scattered in search of a place flyer, had made run after run with his squadron mates, dropping his bomb load, exhausting his ammunition, and capping off his morning by throwing assorted loose items from his cockpit at the Japanese fleet. A Coke bottle, a navigation board, and other vaguely ballistic miscellany. He was a wild sort of kid, with a dangerous look and a reckless demeanour. His father, a New Orleans real estate developer, had tried to keep his son on a productive track, paying an architectural firm to hire him during his summers off from Tulane. But ultimately he was not optimistic about Tommy's future. The kid was given to crazy stunts, driving his convertible from the back seat with his feet on the steering wheel, drinking all night, playing pranks, chasing girls. Once his dad had tried to warn off Tommy's bride-to-be, declaring to her father, "Don't you let that girl get involved with my son. That boy will never amount to anything." True to form, Lupo's interest in aviation seemed to grow out of defiance of his parents' will. In high school he sold enough magazine subscriptions to earn a trip by air to New York, but his parents refused to let him go. When news arrived that the Japanese had struck Pearl Harbor, Lupo was playing poker with his buddies at the house. He seized the chance for an even grander adventure. They broke up the game on the spot and ran down to the New Orleans Customs House looking to enlist. By the time he was in operational flight training at Otay Mesa, California, Tommy Lupo still hadn't kicked his inclination for derring-do. He was always happy to demonstrate his aileron control by buzzing the marshes low enough to whip up a storm of mud with his propeller wash. But he was also a proficient torpedo pilot. During the Saipan campaign, he had had more than a few chances to put his dash into useful service on ground support missions against the dug-in Japanese. Such was the genius of the Navy's Bureau of Personnel to channel the rowdiness of youth toward productive ends. Lupo eased back the throttle of his Avenger and landed on Tacloban, weaving across the muddy tarmac pocked with bomb and artillery craters and strewn with wrecked machinery. As a relatively new acquisition for its United States Army conquerors, the field was still pitted by the handiwork of American bombers and strewn with the remains of Japanese aircraft. Army engineers and Seabees, as the men of the Navy's construction battalion were called, were working to rehabilitate the airstrip. They were pouring truckloads of crushed coral into the muddy patches around the strip, laying a base on which to lay steel mesh mast and runway matting. But the mud was deep, and so the coral vanished like chunks of vanilla ice cream into a sarsaparilla soda. Lupo brought his torpedo bomber down onto a reasonably solid stretch of runway, cut his engine, and rolled to a stop. The first person Lupo saw upon climbing out of the cockpit of the Bayou bomber was an Army bulldozer operator. Knowing that any fighter planes that landed on the field would need more space than he had needed to land safely, Lupo asked the bulldozer driver to clear some more room at the end of the runway. Then, spying crates of ammunition, pyramids of 250-pound bombs, and drums of fuel stockpiled alongside the airfield, Lupo demanded to know who was in charge of the operation. The driver pointed to an Army major. The major was already more than a little interested in who had dared park a Navy plane on his airfield, which was still in the care of the Army engineers and their bulldozers, trucks and roller rigs, and would soon be home to a Marine night fighter squadron that was setting up for operations. Lupo told him of the desperate naval battle raging over the horizon to the northeast. "We've got 6 jeep carriers out there under attack, and our planes have nowhere to land and rearm," Lupo said. "I'd like to get some of this fuel and those bombs and ammunition so we can bring our planes here, load them up, and get back out there." The major took a dim view of the request. "We've got a war going on here too. I can't give you this stuff. I've got planes coming here in 7 to 10 days, P-51s and P-47s,
Lupo asked
and
who
the
the
major's
bombs
superior was. The Army officer mentioned a colonel who was stationed out toward the front. "He's out fighting a war, and I'm not going to bother him." "Well," Lupo said, "that's just too bad." The pilot pulled out his service revolver and pointed it at the major. Then Lupo handed the pistol to his radioman, Earl Gifford, instructing the flabbergasted aircrewman to hold the Army officer at bay. Lupo climbed into the cockpit of his plane and hailed the Fanshawe Bay on the radio. His fellow pilots from VC-68 and other Taffy 3 squadrons were already inbound. Army anti-aircraft gunners opened fire on a gaggle of strange planes circling the field. It took them only a few beats to recognize they were Navy aircraft. Gradually awakening to the dire circumstances of Sprague's fleet and his daring aviators, the men at Tacloban cleared the way for the pilots to land. The strip wasn't ready. The 6 inches of loose black sand that covered the field when Taffy 3's aviators arrived was a lousy surface to land on. Making matters worse, there were as yet no communications facilities in place to guide the planes in, no service squadrons to refuel and rearm them and take the wounded pilots to field hospitals, no airdrome or control tower to coordinate the traffic and determine how the planes would be parked. The result was going to be chaos. The first plane from the new group touched down on a solid stretch of runway, sped forward, caught its landing gear in the soft sand, and pitched forward onto its nose. The pilot coming in behind him, seeing the wreck, pulled out of his landing approach and roared away for another pass. At that, the rest of the inbound planes dispersed like a flight of birds at the first crack of a shotgun, an observer wrote. Unexpectedly, a voice came on the pilot's radio circuit. Navy planes, this is Tacloban airstrip. Beneath you, can you hear me? Come in, please." It was a young Army Air Force officer with Tacloban's fighter control group, Lieutenant Edward Warrad. Driving a radio-equipped jeep as the planes were circling, he was accompanied by a Navy fighter director officer, Lieutenant Russell Forrester, in another radio jeep. Stranded ashore, Forrester had been champing at the bit for days as battles raged in the waters all around him. Now he was finally in a position to help. As Warrad stayed in touch with the planes in the air, Forrester made contact with the 7th Fleet's air controller in Leyte Gulf and informed him of Tacloban's availability. A third man, Sergeant Sam Halpern from Tacloban's service squadron, joined them, checking out the planes that Warrad guided down. Before long, the three men had pieced together an out-of-pocket air control and support squad. Hastily mustering a plane-handling gang from members of the 305th Airdrome Squadron, they helped dozens of Navy Wildcats and Avengers land on the Army field as the battle raged off Samar. The Army volunteers righted flipped aircraft, extinguished fires, and loaded bombs onto the unfamiliar Navy planes. The pilots pitched in, helping to arm and service their planes before taking off again. Japanese air raids were sporadic throughout the day, and friendly planes posed hazards too. Some pilots who took off amid the fragilely managed chaos experienced harrowing and unsolicited games of chicken, an Avenger landing and taxiing down the strip south to north, while a Wildcat roared overhead, taking off north to south. It was not by-the-book airfield management, but they got the job done, serviced and flown off with the help of Army personnel and Navy pilots. The pilots hooked up with Navy air control through Lieutenant Forrester's Jeep radio and were vectored to strike at the Japanese fleet. Fuel and oil trucks skirted around the edge of the strip, their drivers diving flat onto the black sand whenever strafing Japanese planes came in. At one point, a trio of enemy fighters flew in so low that Sam Halpern mistook them for friendlies in the pattern and gave them a green light to land. Incoming planes were waved off while 8 big graders and 4 rollers lumbered across the tarmac, flattening out the little hills and dales of sand made by taxiing aircraft. As soon as they cleared the strip, waves of Navy flyers roared in again. Only 8 planes were total losses at Tacloban that day. Not a single pilot trying to land there was killed. Blue Archer, out of ammo, flew wide circles over and around the Japanese fleet, dropping down to make dry runs on them before passing out of range, climbing again, and wheeling around for another run. Working from 3,000 or 4,000 feet, he would dive to a few hundred feet over his targets and let his gunner and radioman take pot shots at whatever targets were handy. After several such runs, his gunner, in the ball turret, and his radioman, on the bilge gun below, both reported they were out of slugs. Archer was ready to call it a day and head for Tacloban, but then he heard a message from the carriers requesting a torpedo attack. This suggested desperate circumstances. Whoever sent the message had to have known there were few torpedoes in circulation among Taffy 3's planes. Archer waved his wings, signalling 2 other pilots to form up on him. He passed through a squall and got down on the water, running straight for a battleship. Then it happened. The shell exploded no more than 20 yards ahead of him. It was like running into a brick wall, he recalled. Slumped in his seat with a concussion and a back injury that made him numb, Archer fought through the pain and looked to his left. Where a second before there had been a pilot flying on his wing, now all he saw was a cloud of indeterminate aircraft parts hurtling in every direction. Archer kept his course toward the battleship. He opened his bomb bay doors for show, hoping to persuade the dreadnought to veer from its course. Then, as he began to pull up over the ship, Archer rolled his Avenger over on its back and took his .38 caliber service revolver from its holster. Running on anger born of pain and not a little adrenaline, he squeezed the trigger repeatedly, sending 6 rounds into the dark superstructure of the battleship. As he flew over the warship, Archer noticed that the Japanese gunners had stopped firing at him. The Arkansan swears he saw the faces of Japanese bridge personnel staring up at him in bewilderment. He surmised then, and believes to this day, that the Japanese saw him and, seeing his narrow facial lines, goatee, and squinting appearance, took him for a Japanese pilot flying a captured plane and mistook his pistol shots for signals of some kind. Archer loitered over the enemy fleet for 30 more minutes, reporting their movements over the open frequency to the air officer on the Kinan Bay before flying to Tacloban and landing at Lieutenant Warrad's airstrip. For Captain Hathaway, conning the Herman through the cantering herd of escort carriers, amid heavy smoke, spray and fog en route to joining the torpedo run had been no minor adventure. The Herman had nearly collided with the Roberts and the Hoel on the way to attack. Now that his destroyer was clear of the carriers, navigation was the least of his troubles. The sea all around the ship boiled with enemy salvos. When the nearest Japanese ship, a Tone-class heavy cruiser, was just 9,000 yards away, Hathaway ordered a half-salvo of 5 torpedoes fired at her. With the tubes trained per executive officer, Lieutenant Bill Carver's coordinates, Chief Torpedo Man Arthur Owens ordered Mount No. 1 to fire her 5 fish. But when the command went out, fire 1, fire 2, the tube trainer on the second torpedo mount got excited and fired 2 of the 5 torpedoes he was supposed to be reserving for a second attack. Before the mount captain could stop him, they jumped out and ran parallel to their counterparts, leaving only 3 torpedoes for the second launch. The Herman's 7 torpedoes left the ship cleanly, hot, straight and normal, though Bill Carver reported over the sound-powered phones 4 large contacts, giving their range off the port bow. Harold Whitney, the Herman's chief yeoman, couldn't see them. No one could as yet. It was an odd day. One moment the sun was shining, and the sky seemed clear as a bell, and the next moment you were in a rain squall and it was dark as night. The rain blotted out our radar, and we had no way of knowing how close we were to the battleships. Suddenly the Herman emerged from a squall, and all too clearly, dead ahead, lay the 4 largest ships Kurita had. Lieutenant Bill Meaders, the gunnery officer, could see 2 Congo-class battleships advancing in column. Beyond them, looming in the haze, were 2 ships that looked even bigger. Whitney figured the Herman would be sunk on the spot. The bigger ships, however, seemed to be having trouble targeting the small destroyer at close range. Lieutenant Meadors had the Haruna square in the sights of his directoscope. He could see the battleship's 4 double-barrel 14-inch main turrets, housing rifles 54 feet long, turned out to starboard in a frightening array. Flashes and smoke seemed to swallow the ship each time it fired. First the front and back turrets fired, and 4 shells screamed overhead at mast level, hitting the ocean 1,000 yards beyond the destroyer. Then the 2 high-mounted turrets let go. The Herman madly returned fire all along. Lieutenant Meadors had the firing key closed, which caused the guns to discharge as soon as their projectile trays were rammed into the breach. Another roar came from the Haruna, a full broadside, and the battleship's 4 turrets, flashing as one, illuminated the entire ocean on our starboard hand, Meadors wrote. The 8 heavy rounds screamed overhead and missed. Salvos from the Haruna and 3 other battleships raised walls of water all around the ship. The colourful towers blotted out the blue and grey skies. Watching the near misses bracketing his ship and cascading over his superstructure made Amos Hathaway wish he had a periscope with which to see over the wall of water. Everything looked rosy, he would write, but only because the splashes were coloured red by the dye loads. The Haruna's gunnery officer, Commander Masao Gondaira, saw the sleek lines of his antagonist and believed he was duelling a heavy cruiser. Harold Whitney had fewer illusions as he played a pointless game of hide-and-seek with the inbound, looking like rusty spots in the sky, coming directly at me. The little rusty spots came on, and I ducked behind the wing of the bridge, a little thin piece of metal that wouldn't stop a .45 caliber pistol slug. The first salvos missed, slapping the sea in a ladder pattern 300 yards long. Whitney looked up and saw that the ship's signal halyards had been cut in 2, and the rangefinder had been lopped off. As he was looking up, something smaller hit them. A small shell, or maybe some shrapnel, and wooden splinters flew, the remnants of the motor whaleboat blown from its davits. Lieutenant Meaders' 5 main battery crews fired some 260 shells at the battleship. From close range, 4 to 8,000 yards away, Meaders watched his shells explode all along the ship's menacing form. It was anyone's guess what damage the 54-pound rounds did to the armoured giant. Judging by the smoke and flame that wreathed the battle wagon's towering superstructure, it was reasonable to think the destroyer was giving back a little bit of the hell that had engulfed the bridges of the Johnston and the Hoel shortly before. From what Meadors could see, the effect was considerable. About 4 minutes went by during which the Haruna lay broadside to the destroyer but did not fire at all. While all this was happening, the Herman's 7 torpedoes bubbled on their course. The last 3 had been fired without the aid of mechanical range-finding. Whitney took ranges from the surface radar and relayed them to Owens, who calmly turned the dials on the torpedo mount, with a sudden release of compressed air. The torpedoes were on their way. It took less than 10 minutes for Hathaway's destroyer to fire 7 torpedoes at a heavy cruiser, change course toward the battleship line, engage the lead vessel with main batteries, fire 3 more torpedoes, and turn to speed away. Few warships in history had ever spent 10 minutes more productively. At 8:03 a.m., Hathaway returned to the pilot house from the open-air bridge and raised Ziggy Sprague on the talk-between-ships radio. His message was remarkable for its professional nonchalance. "My exercise is completed." "Over." Hathaway wondered at his own choice of words until he recognized his instinct that the Japanese might be eavesdropping on the circuit, in which event there was no need to inform them that his ship had fired the last of its torpedoes. Shortly thereafter, as if to reward Amos Townsend Hathaway for his brio and dash, the only destroyer captain in history to engage directly 4 battleships supported by heavy cruisers and live to tell the tale. A cloud of black smoke boiled up near the stern of the Haruna, beneath its hindmost 14-inch turret. The visual evidence was followed closely by a deep blast rumbling across the water. A torpedo from the Herman's final spread of 3 appeared to have scored. Ironically, however, it may have been the first fan of torpedoes, all 7 of which seemed to miss, that did Ziggy Sprague the best. They sizzled off to the north, missing their intended target, the cruiser. Continuing on, they approached the battleship Yamato. At 7:56 a.m., a lookout on Kurita's flagship signalled the warning, "Watch out for torpedo tracks." Then the Nagato spotted 3 tracks approaching starboard. Duly warned, the vessel's commander, Admiral Yuji Kobe, ordered a hard turn to port. As the wakes of the torpedoes passed alongside the Nagato to starboard, the battleship opened fire on a cruiser, probably the Herman, at a close range of 9,400 yards. All of a sudden, 2 more torpedoes were seen approaching the Yamato to port. The helmsman turned her rudder hard over to port, putting the super battleship on a northward course, away from its quarry, so as to present the smallest possible profile to the torpedoes. It was a panicked decision. Admiral Ugaki should have turned toward the torpedoes, combing their tracks in pursuit rather than in retreat. "For 10 decisive minutes it felt like a month to me," wrote Ugaki. "The parallel spreads hemmed in the great ship, pinning her into an outbound course. The instinct for survival demonstrated by the Yamato's commander seemed to put the lie to any notion that the center force was on a one-way mission, driven by the heavenly guidance that Admiral Toyoda had invoked from Combined Fleet Headquarters. At the moment of decision, the officers of the Yamato succumbed to the universal impulse to save their ship. They held the course north until the torpedoes' alcohol reservoirs burned dry. By the time the undersea missiles ceased their pursuit, disappearing into the 4,000-fathom depths of the Philippine Trench, Ugaki had taken the Yamato's 69-foot-long guns and the center force's brain trust clear out of the battle. In the engagement's first minute, Kurita had forfeited control of his fleet by ordering a hurried general attack. Now, having fallen back more than 30,000 yards from the fleeing escort carriers, he lost what limited ability he retained to command and direct his force. At 7:50 a.m., Admiral Stump's Taffy 2 carriers were launching the last of their first airstrike in support of Taffy 3. A raid comprising 15 Avengers and 20 Wildcats, Admiral Sprague radioed to his destroyer escorts, "All small boys go in and launch torpedo attack." The Johnston and the Hoel had already passed into harm's way and launched their fish. The Roberts and the Herman were at that moment only minutes away from releasing theirs. The new order sprang the Dennis and the Raymond into action, the John C. Butler, laying smoke on the far southern side of the formation, was out of position to intercept the speeding enemy cruisers. It was preposterous to send a destroyer escort against an enemy's main surface fleet. They didn't do it on paper at the Naval War College, and it had not happened in the whole course of the war leading up to October 25. As the Dennis and the Raymond sortied, Bob Copeland's ship was fighting like a true hunter-killer, bidding to take down a heavy cruiser on the open sea. The Hoel had fired 2 salvos of 5 torpedoes each, the Herman had fired 7, then 3. If Copeland was lucky, Samuel B. Roberts would soon be in position to fire her single salvo of 3. In a quieter time, in Hawaii, before the ship's departure for the far reaches of the Western Pacific Combat Zone, the admiral who commanded United States destroyer forces in the Pacific had informed Copeland that he had recommended replacing the Roberts's torpedo tubis with a new 40mm gun mount. Copeland had surprised even himself with the tenor of his refusal. "Admiral, someday somebody is going to forget we're boys and send us over to do a man's work. If I'm ever sent to do a man's work, I want a man's weapons." Then Copeland smiled a little. "Admiral, as far as my ship is concerned, the torpedo tubes will be removed over my dead body." Due either to Copeland's persuasive skills or to lack of follow-through by the bureaucracy, the Samuel B. Roberts left Pearl Harbor with her one triple torpedo mount in place. Now her captain had a chance to do what no destroyer escort had done before, and actually use them against an enemy heavy. Copeland was glad he hadn't wasted precious time trying to form up with the other destroyer escorts on the far side of Taffy 3's ring formation. Like Captains Evans, Kintberger and Hathaway before him, Copeland knew that his first and only chance to stagger a larger foe depended on his performance now. As the Roberts closed on the cruiser line, Lieutenant Bill Burton, Copeland's gun boss, was anxious to open fire with his 2 5-inch guns. Burton's 2-gun crews were primed and ready. But there were still about 13,000 yards of ocean between the Roberts and her target, a sleek heavy cruiser, probably the Chokai, steaming off the starboard bow. Every few minutes he asked, "Captain, may I open fire?" His skipper thought he had ants in his pants. Copeland didn't want to waste valuable 5-inch ammunition at extended range, where aim was dicey and hitting power diminished. He wanted to get closer, and so far, so good, he doubted the Japanese ship had yet spotted him. The sea through which the little ship charged was wreathed in smoke from the destroyers that had attacked ahead of her. Though numerous targets presented themselves, Copeland denied Burton's request to open fire. The gunnery officer kept the requests coming until finally Copeland shouted, "God damn it, Mr. Burton, I'll let you know when you may open fire." Through smoke that was thick but intermittent, Copeland's visibility alternated between about 5 miles and 0. On the radar scope's plan position indicator screen, he could see the 2 green-white slivers of the American destroyers running south toward him. Aided by the scope, he had little risk of a collision. Poor visibility or none, the torpedo attack was in excellent hands. Bob Roberts was lining it up. The exec wanted to close to 5,000 yards and launch the 3 fish on a high-speed 45-knot setting. At that speed, and from that range, the torpedoes would be difficult for the target cruiser to spot and avoid. Seated on the triple torpedo mount, Chief Torpedo Man Rudy Scow had his speed-setting wrench in hand, preparing to match his aiming pointers to the coordinates relayed by the exec. Suddenly there was a windy, ripping rush and a crash of metal as a Japanese shell passed through the Roberts's rigging. The shell severed the radio antenna, and a large section of it, carrying a mass of dangling wires, fell down across the deck, whipping over Scow's hand, nearly breaking it, and knocking the wrench into the water before the adjustments could be made. The torpedoes lay in their tubes, still set on intermediate speed. A spare wrench was kept down in the torpedo shack, but Roberts and Scow both knew there was no time to fetch it. As the Samuel B. Roberts closed with its target, Bob Roberts reran the firing solution in his head. The enemy's course and speed and its range and bearing off the bow determined the torpedo speed, deflection, and gyro setting. The variables were complex, and over the long course of a 3-mile range to target, even a small error could become magnified into a gross inaccuracy. But the exec, quick with calculations, managed his best guess and shouted the tube train settings down to Chief Scow. The Chokai was unleashing withering fire from her forward 8-inch batteries, but her gunners were not targeting the Roberts. They either did not see or did not care about the small ship with the low silhouette. No shells landed near her, though the shells arcing high overhead toward the carriers. Or perhaps it was the blasts of the gun muzzles themselves, buffeted the destroyer escort with their turbulence. Time seemed to stop, yet before Copeland knew it, the Roberts was just 4,000 yards from the cruiser line, a little over 2 miles, and his 3 torpedoes were waterborne, racing toward the cruisers on Bob Roberts's improvised firing solution. On the broad ocean's surface, 4,000 yards, was point-blank range. Copeland, his ship as yet unscathed, ordered a hard left rudder, turning the Roberts back through her own smoke and toward the carriers. Down below, Lieutenant Trowbridge brought every pound of steam pressure online. The deck shook from the twin turbines' whining, roaring labours. The ship ran past its rated limits, to 28.5 knots and possibly beyond. As time ran down on the torpedo run, 3 or 4 minutes, Copeland indulged himself with a peek astern. Through a gap in the smoke, he was treated to the sight of a steaming column of water and flame rising from below the aftermast of what he took for an Fez-class cruiser. Possibly it was the Chokai. As the Samuel B. Roberts raced back to her station to lay smoke by the carriers, Copeland heard someone yell, "We got her!" A cheer went up from all hands on deck, as if someone had hit a late-inning homer. From his gun director, Bob Hagan looked forward over the Johnston's starboard bow and was shocked to see an American destroyer on a collision course. It was the Herman. The destroyer emerged from a smoke screen heading straight at Evans's ship, just 200 yards away. Evans shouted, "All engines back full." Ed DeGardi ran to the pilot house and pulled back full on the engine room telegraph and ordered a left full rudder. The Johnston's riddled hull shuddered as its one working propeller bit into the water. The Herman did the same with her twin screws. Stationed on the depth charge racks on the Johnston's fantail, Bob Deal was nearly pitched over the side from the sudden change in momentum. Our stern dug deep into the sea, and the ocean boiled over the afterdeck. As water engulfed the destroyer's fantail, the Herman was so close, less than 10 feet, that someone could have hurtled it over to the other ship's deck. Crewmen watching let out a roar of celebration as the ships backed down. Several crew on the Johnston's deck at this point saw the wakes of 3 torpedoes passing silently below the surface, narrowly missing the ship. The 2 ships formed up momentarily into column. The Herman would outrace the damaged Johnston quickly enough, and headed south astern the carriers. At some point between 8:08 a.m. and 8:24 a.m., the Herman was firing its main batteries at targets to starboard. This is when Chief Yeoman Harold Whitney, Captain Hathaway's talker, heard over his headset an excited shout from a portside lookout. Appearing unexpectedly out of the smoke and haze came a destroyer. From the starboard bridge wing, Whitney looked across his ship's narrow beam and saw the tin can steaming close alongside to port. Walking over to take a closer look, he saw the sharp rising prow, the blocky superstructure, the twin main gun mount, and the foreign dress of a sailor scurrying around pointing at the American destroyer, and he realized the ship was Japanese. "I could have thrown a potato and hit that kid running around there," Whitney said. Whitney returned to the starboard bridge wing and called the shocking development to Amos Hathaway's attention, recommending that he order the Herman's machine gunners to engage the intruder at point-blank range. Unfazed, the skipper said to his talker, "I can't shoot at them now. We're busy with these cruisers over here." Evidently the Imperial Tin can had other priorities as well. After several tense minutes, the ship peeled off to port and disappeared through the smoke and squalls that had covered its arrival. Ziggy Sprague's flat tops should have been run down and butchered like antelope on the step, but they continued to elude that seemingly predestined fate. At 8:10 a.m. Sprague's carriers were on a southwesterly heading, fleeing with the wind. The cruiser column led by the Tone, followed by the Chikuma, the Haguro, and the Chokai, was to Sprague's northeast, running south, working a clockwise circular course toward the southwest. The aggression of the screening ships and the doggedness of the pilots were making their mark. 80 minutes into the pursuit, the Japanese still had not overtaken them for slaughter, their 13-knot speed advantage notwithstanding. Every time a pursuing cruiser had to veer from course to avoid a torpedo bomber, General Motors approaching with torpedo bay doors open, Sprague won valuable time. Every time a wildcat pilot rattled a cruiser's pilot house, sending officers diving to the deck, it delayed course change orders and frustrated the concentration of spotters peering through their binoculars. As his carriers plodded along on a course of 205 degrees to the south-southwest, Sprague could scarcely believe his luck up to this point. At 8:14 a.m., Felix Stump heard him on the radio saying, "We have been straddled for the last half hour. We have not been hit yet. Their shooting is very bad." Admiral Kurita tended to see another reason for his inability to close for the kill. His opponents were swift fleet carriers and cruisers, able to outrun him on their own. Kurita watched his ships fail to close the range and knew he could not afford to chase them forever. He had his own fuel shortages to worry about. For all Kurita knew, this was the United States Third Fleet, just 15 hours ago. Halsey's and Mitchell's planes had sunk one of Japan's two greatest battleships, the Musashi. Aboard her sister ship, the Yamato, there was disagreement about where the Third Fleet was. The Japanese had heard Kinkaid's pleas for help from heavy American ships, though Admiral Shirishi on the Kumano had reason to know otherwise. Having sighted light carriers and recorded that fact in his log, he failed to report it to superiors. And so Kurita continued to believe that his opponents were larger, faster, and more capable than they actually were. He had no idea how desperate his enemy was, though neither Ziggy Sprague nor his captains had any reason to know it. The best way to turn back the Japanese onslaught was for their torpedo-less tin cans and their weaponless airplanes to keep the bluff going. Following its near collision with the Herman, the Johnston's protracted streak of astonishing luck seemed simply to run out. The ship was taking hits regularly now. Shells struck in deep syncopated rhythms, each slightly less momentous and terrifying to the crew than the one before, an undifferentiated cadence that seemed to diminish in effect as shell shock set in. An armour-piercing round passed through the thin metal of an exhaust stack without exploding. Another shell rained metal shards all over the bridge, knocked crew to the deck, and showered them with asbestos insulation. Robert Billy felt something strike his communications headset, and somehow his mouth was full of blood and broken teeth. Down in the engine room, the hits jarred asbestos lagging from the steam pipes and blinked the lights. According to Charles Landreth, the ship felt like it was shaking apart. There was a noise on the earphones, and it felt like it blew my eardrums out. Then, for a short time, the phones were dead. Then someone got on the phones and said we had been hit and everyone on the bridge had been killed. Quartermaster Neil Deathlefs could see a large ship on the northern horizon, bright flashes leaping from its two forward turrets. The silent yellow strobes of light were followed, after a delay of several dozen seconds, by a rising freight train roar as the large shells ripped into the sea. He saw 3 hit to port and 3 more to starboard. "I was sure the next salvo was coming into the pilot house," he wrote later. "I prayed that if it did, I would get the full package and not be left with an arm or leg missing. It didn't appear we would be alive much longer," said Charles Landreth. "Up to this time the thought of us not making it hadn't bothered me much. I still had not seen with my eyes people getting killed, but that was soon to come. Fear was written on everyone's face in the engine room. The senior engineering officer, Lieutenant Joe Walling, was coming and going, moving back and forth between the engine room and the fire room that energized his turbines with steam. From the expression in their lieutenant's eyes, the men understood their chances. I could tell by looking at him that our ship was in its first and last surface engagement, Landreth said. If sheer human will could have propelled the USS Hoel on a southwesterly course back toward the carriers, she would have made 36 knots. As it was, on only one good engine, steered manually, and confronted with an unceasing rain of fire from multiple enemy ships, the destroyer had no chance to escape. As the rain squalls began to yield to the morning sun, the Japanese had a clear view of the stricken tin can, which now paid the price for Leon Kintberger's gallant headlong run into the enemy's midst. The wounded vessel was trapped in a savage crossfire. A cruiser was close by, so close at some 4,000 yards that even the 40mm guns could hit her. Their rhythmic thumping was in syncopation with the blasts of the two forward 5 inches. Targets were in oversupply, but so were Japanese shells. They came from both sides, whistling and roaring and crashing to starboard and port, exploding overhead, filling the air with candy colours and showering the decks with shrapnel, drilling straight through the hull. Lieutenant Dix, you heard the whistling whine and grinding thud, the iron rumble following the blast, the rattle of the instruments and gear. You felt the shudder running through the hull, the shaking of the deck beneath your feet, the quiver in your limbs as each one struck. The masts and radars toppled down on deck, main radio and chart house took a hit, boats, life rafts, stacks were riddled with the spray of lead and steel from airbursts crashing high. The decks were a killing field. Bob Prater sought refuge in the aft torpedo room, but it was full of corpses. He moved to the port side and saw steam coming out of the fire room. The men were coming out mortally scalded. There was blood and bodies everywhere. Around this time, the skipper of the Raymond, Lieutenant Commander A.F. Beer, Jr., spotted an American ship taking a terrific beating. He thought it was the Samuel B. Roberts, but Copeland's ship had yet to be hit. It was more likely the Hoel. That he apparently mistook the destroyer for a destroyer escort may have been testimony to the battering Kintberger's ship had taken. Her silhouette was scarcely even recognizable anymore. Her mast had fallen over the superstructure, and she had only 2 working 5-inch guns. Captain Beyer could see her rapid-fire salvos going out at the enemy. The bombardment that came in return was horrifying. It appeared to overwhelm her, swallowing the ship in a curtain of flashes. A salvo struck the Hoel below the waterline, bulling through the forward engine room and letting in the sea. Lieutenant Commander John Plum got many of his men out before they were drowned at their stations and secured the boilers before they could blow. But this hit sealed the Hoel's fate. Her last engine was gone. Slowly and ever more slowly, the Hoel drifted, her list worsening by the minute. Japanese heavy cruisers and battleships were firing point-blank into her hull. Bobby Despain took cover on the deck beside the depth charge racks. Lying on the deck, he recalled, I looked down at myself and thought I'd been hit. My body was covered with blood and gore that had flowered aft down the gutters onto me. The Hoel's 2 forward guns fired back, crudely aimed, in the absence of a working Foxdog set and Mark 37 gun director by the surface search and gunnery radar. The Tone-class cruiser, looming just 2,000 yards to port, had slowed down. Whether it did so from battle damage or to steady its gun platform for a final, killing fusillade is not known. It presented an excellent target for gunners who were not ready to quit. The top hatch of Gun 52 was open, and Chester Fay, the gun captain, was standing up out of it, congratulating his crew in the mount whenever they scored a hit. On the bridge, Lieutenant Dix saw him and was moved. He looked up toward the bridge as if to say, "We're still not licked." In Gun 51 swung their mounts to starboard and engaged 3 destroyers closing in to the point that machine guns could have opened fire. To good effect had they been working. Someone on the bridge shouted the command to open fire, but power was gone, and most of the men on the 40s just forward of the superstructure were dead or wounded. Aft, the prospects were still worse. The light weaponry back there had been ripped to pieces and smashed, bent down and wrenched from the deck plates. Dick saw the crews of some destroyed guns hunkered behind their shields. A shell from the Tone-class cruiser passed through a bulkhead and through a forward magazine, starting a fire that raged below Gun 51. But its crew blasted away at one of the Japanese destroyers, which continued to press in, undaunted. Off the Hoel's starboard bow, the stubby blue form of a Wildcat fighter plane appeared. The aircraft fell on a Japanese destroyer, coming in low and fast, a rain of spent shell cases cascading from its wings. The storm of .50 caliber lead rattled the Japanese destroyer so hard that the sound of the ricochets and penetrations could be heard on the decks of Kintberger's ship. As the Hoel drifted, a shell struck the forward stack. Lieutenant Miles Barrett, the supply officer, was standing on the catwalk by the 40mm remote control console, filming the battle with the ship's 16mm movie camera. The hit set the ship's whistle shrieking. Some of the crew thought it was the abandoned ship signal. From the bridge, Lieutenant Dix looked down on the decks and watched men dragging wounded to the rails and leaping into the sea. They took no life jackets, left rafts and nets, nothing to hold them up but their arms. More than 100 must have gone this way. They couldn't hear us yelling from the bridge. Roy Lozano was climbing the ladder from the forward fire room when the blast wave from the hit struck him. Whoever was above him on the ladder was blown to pieces. The force of the explosion was so great that it ripped the seam right out of my pants, he recalled. But we continued to climb up, only to walk over dead bodies. When we arrived topside, we went to the port side of the ship to try to get one of the lifeboats down. I don't know why we were trying to get it down, as it was shot full of holes. The explosion in the fire room collapsed the bulkhead that separated it from the emergency generator room, a compartment below decks that housed the electrical generator that kicked in if main power boards failed. Glenn Foster, an interior communications electrician, was knocked to the floor as the generator toppled down on him. As hot steam poured into his space, he pushed open the hatch leading forward from his small compartment, but found only smoke and fire. He tried going up to the next deck, but the escape hatch was jammed. Foster panicked when he discovered that he'd been turning the hatch the wrong way. He opened it finally, made his way through an escape hatch that led through the internal communications room, and found that it had become a charnel house, piled to a sickening depth with bodies and body parts. One of the hits the Hoel took destroyed the ship's safe, as Supply Officer Miles Barrett was responsible for dispersing cash to the crew on payday. With the shattering of the large iron deposit box, suddenly it was payday, money was fluttering everywhere, bills came blasting out of a hole in the bulkhead, Barrett said. The $50 bills settled and stuck fast on the deck, the gruesome windfall drifting with the flow of blood down into the bilges. The ships of Taffy 3's screen fired the last of their torpedoes when Captains Beyer of the Raymond and Sig Hansen of the Dennis answered Sprague's call, releasing their 3 torpedoes at a Japanese heavy cruiser not long after the Roberts did, and observing but claiming no credit for at least one hit. After his torpedoes were gone, Beyer wheeled the Raymond around to a 110-degree course, swiftly crossing 4 miles of sea, barking away with her main batteries until the range to the Japanese heavy cruiser was just 5,700 yards. The Raymond acquitted herself well enough in her ensuing gunnery duel with the Haguro to brag in any company. The crew in the handling room below Gun 52 worked so hard that several men collapsed from heat exhaustion. The aft repair party relieved them, with only slightly less impressive results, although some time delay-fused anti-aircraft rounds found their way into the hoist, resulting in a few shells exploding prematurely en route to the target. The Raymond fired 414 rounds of 5-inch ammunition at the Haguro, landing numerous hits all across her superstructure. Then, improbably, the Haguro turned and headed away to the east, and Beyer checked the Raymond's fire. The smoke floating over the seas in the vicinity of the Johnston was so thick that Captain Evans ordered Bob Hagan not to fire his battery unless he could actually see what he intended to shoot. He had no idea what had become of his sister ships in the screen, no sense adding to their misery by hitting them with friendly fire. Through the smoke, cruising 7,000 yards off the Johnston's port beam, Hagan spotted the profile of the 36,000-ton British-built monster, the Congo. The pagoda superstructure and mainmast seemed to crowd the shortened forecastle, where 2 twin 14-inch gun mounts lay. A third main battery mount sat just behind the aftermast, some distance farther aft, set so far astern gun number 3 as to accentuate her tremendous length, was her 4th main gun. Hagan took in the sight of the battleship and muttered to himself, "Well, I sure as hell can see that." Once more he slewed his director toward a new target and closed his firing key. In just 40 seconds, the destroyer sent 30 shells at the Leviathan, landing by Hagan's estimation 15 hits on the smoke. The battleship belched a few 14 inches at us, but thank God, registered only clean misses. Several miles behind the other surviving ships of Taffy 3's screen, the Johnston headed south at half speed. Overtaking Evans's ship to port was the cruiser line and the battleships behind them. To her right, a line of enemy destroyers advanced to gunnery range. As wicked as the crossfire was, a sight now commanded everyone's attention on the Johnston's bridge, an escort carrier listing to port, dead in the water and taking heavy fire. It was the Gambia Bay. Given her position on the windward side of the formation, the Gambia Bay rode in nearly plain sight of the cruisers to her east, her own smoke screen, and that of the tailing destroyer screen blown to the west. There was no telling how many ships had drawn a bead on her now. Under fire for nearly 90 minutes, the Gambia Bay, steaming behind the Kinan Bay, took her first hit at 8:20 a.m. when a shell penetrated her forward engine room. The sea flooded in, and even the strenuous exertions of the bilge pumps and 2 portable submersible pumps could not prevent the burners from being swamped. As machinists secured the flooded boilers, the speed differential between the damaged escort carrier and her pursuers opened widely. The tight circle of Taffy 3's 6 escort carriers stretched and fractured as the Gambia Bay, struggling along at 11 knots, dropped out of the formation and receded toward the cruisers closing in on her port quarter. A signalman on the Gambia Bay's 24-inch carbon arc searchlight, Don Herrick, spotted 3 ships to the southeast, flashing a recognition signal. They were the Taffy 2 destroyers, Haley, Haggard, and Franks, which Admiral Stump had ordered north to intercept any Japanese ships that might pursue his escort carriers. Ensign Cole Williams, the Gambia Bay's signal officer, ordered Herrick to acknowledge the challenge and request assistance. The signalman opened the shutters of his lamp and blinkered. "We are under attack. Please help." No sooner had he finished the message than a large shell ripped the air close enough to burn his forearms and knock Williams to the deck. In turn, the Taffy 2 destroyers blinkered Morse for Roger, standard shorthand for message received, then turned and withdrew to the south. Upon learning at 8:17 a.m. that Japanese battleship shells were straddling his destroyers, Taffy 2 Commander Admiral Stump decided against risking his most capable escorts in a dicey offensive action. If the Japanese destroyed Taffy 3 and continued south, he would need them for his own defence. Chased by salvos of 14-inch shells, the Haley, the Haggard, and the Franks turned and raced south, after having closed, unmolested, to within 15,000 yards of the Haruna and the Congo. High above, Edward Huxtable, commander of the Gambia Bay's Air Group, VC-10, sighted the carrier taking concentrated fire from Japanese cruisers. As the FM-2 Wildcats escorting him winged over into strafing runs, Huxtable turned, descended, and levelled off in a mock torpedo attack. He made 4 such runs, each time keeping up the ruse, flying level with bomb bay doors open. Each time he did so, he attracted a lot of attention from Japanese anti-aircraft gunners. Then Huxtable became aware of reinforcements on the way. "I heard flight leaders from the other escort carrier group preparing for attacks," he said, and decided that the situation was much improved and left for Tacloban at 9:15 a.m. to bomb up. It was plain, however, that the Gambia Bay was in deep trouble. When the engine room was abandoned 5 minutes after its boilers were secured, Lieutenant Hank Pizdrowski, an Avenger pilot who had been stranded when his ship turned out of the headwind in favour of its own survival, felt the intensity of the deck vibrations slacken. He looked up at the ship's tiny island superstructure and saw the battle ensign droop. With a boiler gone, the 18-knot ship could do only 11 knots. She began listing to port. The volume of ordnance flying the ship's way was so great as to register on the ship's surface search radar. In the Gambia Bay's Combat Information Centre, Lieutenant Bill Cuming was watching the surface radar's A-scope, taking ranges on the Japanese ships. Every now and then a quick stray blip would appear on the graph, the echo return from an inbound Japanese shell. Cuming could do nothing with that information except appreciate how long the odds were against the ship surviving much longer. Every minute, it seemed, a salvo landed near the ship. Usually at least one shell in each salvo inflicted some damage. The vibrations were so severe, the men had trouble staying on their feet. A shell went off behind him, and aviation machinist's mate, third-class Tony Potokniak, was knocked to the catwalk on the port side of the ship. He stood and moved forward, preoccupied with thoughts of what the inscription on his gravestone might say. Lost at sea, age 19 years. Potocniek found bodies laid flat across the bloodied wooden flight deck. He entered a compartment that had been turned into a first aid station. Lieutenant Commander Wayne Stewart, VC-10's flight surgeon, shooed him aside so he could get at a severely wounded sailor lying on a stretcher. Just then another shell hit. The blast showered shrapnel into Potocniak's hand and legs and cut down Commander Stewart as he was tending to the man. The doctor fell dead on top of his patient. Photographer's mate, second class Alan Johnson, was crossing a catwalk when he came upon a sailor crumpled against a bulkhead, clutching his arms in front of him and weeping softly. I'm ruined, the kid was saying. Looking down, Johnson saw that his abdomen had been torn wide open. He walked forward, past a 40mm gun mount, and encountered a crewman he had once heard griping about the boredom of life on an escort carrier. When are we going to see some real action? This kid had wanted to know. Johnson looked at him now. He was glassy-eyed, gazing into the distance, and couldn't resist a dig. Well, buddy, is this enough action for you? No answer came from his lips, but a stream of little saliva bubbles. Amos Hathaway heard his Admiral Ziggy Sprague cut in on the talk between ships circuit at 8:26 a.m. Small boys on my starboard quarter intercept enemy cruiser coming in on my port quarter. Each carrier had its own gun, a single-mounted 5-inch or 38 caliber on its fantail, and its crew knew how to use it. But to fend off cruisers, Sprague would need the help of a real surface combatant. Hathaway saw the Johnston limping southward, trying to comply with Sprague's order. It was quite evident, as Captain Evans's stricken ship moved to interdict, that it wasn't getting anywhere fast on one screw. A signal light blinkered the message, "Only one engine X, no gyro X, no radars." The destroyer was in trouble, but the Herman still had her legs. Hathaway swung his destroyer into a tight turn to port and tore across the rear of the carrier formation toward the enemy. There remained the question of exactly how a destroyer bereft of torpedoes would turn away an armoured ship of the line. Using double talk on the open circuit, which he thought the enemy was surely monitoring, Hathaway tried to tell Sprague that he had no more torpedoes aboard. He heard other skippers doing the same. As I listened, he later recounted, it became evident that there wasn't a torpedo among us. Anything we could do from now on would have to be mostly bluff. The Herman broke from the smoke to find the squat bulk of an escort carrier bearing down on her off the port bow. It was the Fanshawe Bay. Hathaway backed down to a stop to avoid a collision. Then, when the ship was out of the way, he had a clear view of what Sprague was anxious about. Ahead lay the Gambia Bay, afire amidships, listing 20 degrees to port, and taking a ceaseless battering from a Tone-class cruiser to her east. The wounded carrier obscured most of the Japanese ship, so Hathaway manoeuvred to gain a clearer line of sight.